All right. Again, welcome to our web conference today. My name is Sarah. I'm with the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. I'm going to be your tech host today. And while folks are trickling in, I just have a few housekeeping items so that you all feel comfortable with this technology and what we're doing. Hopefully you can see a whole bunch of faces, friendly faces. And we're really excited for you to be with us today. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and materials will be made available on our website after this webinar, the PowerPoint, the recording, and any supplemental materials that might come up, we'll make sure to gather and make available to everybody. If you registered, even if you're not able to attend, you'll receive an email that gives you access to all of that. So just look for that in the coming days. Like I said, if this is, if this webinar took over your screen, if you hover at the top, you should be able to change your view options to exit full screen. So you can pull up the chat bar and you can do what you need to do. A few other items in the top right-hand corner, you'll again see a button to expand or exit out of the full screen. You'll also see the button on the left allows you to change the view of speakers. You can see all of us, or you can see just the folks who are talking. So feel free to play around with that. And then on the left-hand toolbar, you'll see your audio settings. If you need to change to phone, please click the chat button now. We'll be using that throughout the web conference today. And if you have any technical issues in particular, please raise your hand simply by clicking the raise hand button, and I'll chat with you. So if you have that chat button open, love to hear from you all as we roll in. So let us know who you are, where you're from, and what's kind of exciting for you about today's webinar. And as you pull all that stuff up and start chatting with us, I am going to hand all of this over to Erica to also introduce our partners and panelists today. So Erica, if you just click the screen and keep clicking, you should have control.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's see if I can figure this out.
Mouse click. You just click the screen. Can you try that? There you go.
There we go. Sorry. Now I need to figure out how to go back. Okay. Okay. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. I am very happy to have the opportunity to introduce all of the critical partners on this project and to share the background of the project with you all, and to welcome you. There's a large number of folks joining us today from all over the country who occupy all different types of spaces in terms of the type of work that you're doing, the organizations that you're working with, the ways in which you're advocating for survivors. And so we are absolutely thrilled to have everybody's perspective, expertise on this webinar today, so that we can all think together about the topic, which is racial and economic equity for domestic and sexual violence survivors. Before we launch into talking specifics about the project, what I'd like to do is introduce all of the key players in this work. So first is Casa de Esperanza. And I'm not sure if folks can have their voices heard at this point, but if so, feel free to say hello.
Hello.
Here. If you could say your name as I introduce the organization, that would be wonderful. So Casa de Esperanza.
Hi, everyone. This is Pierre Berastein from Casa de Esperanza.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pierre. We have the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Khan representing the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence today.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much. The Women of Color Network.
Hi, everyone. This is Tanya Lovelace Davis, CEO for Women of Color Network, Inc., and I'll pass it to Purvi.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Purvi Shah, consultant with Women of Color Network. And so glad to be on with you all.
Wonderful. We also have the Texas Council on Family Violence.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mona Morrow with the Texas Council on Family Violence. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Great. The Kierman Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity.
Hello, this is Kip Howley, Research Associate with the Kerwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Glad to be here today.
Thanks, Kip. Also, the Southwest Center for Law and Policy.
Hallie, I saw that you joined. I'll work with you, Hallie. This is Sarah, and we'll get you linked in.
Okay. So that's Hallie Bonger White, who I know is with us, and we'll hear her voice as we move forward. Also, Camille Holmes. And Bill Kennedy.
Hi, everyone. This is Bill Kennedy. I'm a consultant on issues of advocacy for the program.
Wonderful. So you've also heard a little bit from Sarah, and I want to make sure that you also are introduced to CSAJ's Legal and Policy Director, Lisa Lynn Jacobs.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Erica. I'm Lisa Lynn Jacobs, the Legal and Policy Director for the Center for Survivor and Agency Justice. Looking forward to the webinar.
Wonderful. So for those who haven't had a chance to speak, you will be hearing from many of us throughout the call today. And also, we just as a way of kind of getting us used to things for today's conversation, we really do want to hear from you all of the participants in the call today, because this is a thinking process and a critical thinking and critical action process. And so please do feel free to use the chat function and make sure that we're hearing from you throughout the course of the call. We'll find opportunities for weaving in conversation. Going to move along. Here we go. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of background about the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, and some of the background that led to the Racial and Economic Equity for Survivors project, and then I'll hand it over to Lisa Lynn. CSAJ has a very broad and ambitious vision, which is to CSAJ envisions a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. And our mission is specifically focused on advocacy that's taking place on multiple levels. So our mission is to promote advocacy approaches that remove systemic barriers, enhance organizational responses, and improve professional practices to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. CSAJ has been around since 2006, and our work really came from the perspective of working with many attorneys and advocates in the field and recognizing a service orientation of a lot of violence against women work. So in other words, what we were interested in doing was shifting the work from one that was defined by the service provided to one that was defined by survivors and the communities of which they are a part. So it has been that survivor-centered focus that has led much of our work. As you would imagine, one of the key pieces of work that starts from that perspective that bubbles to the surface, so to speak, is a focus on economic justice, because we know that economics and access to material resources is so critical to the long-term safety of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. And so some of this information may be familiar to folks who have worked with us in the past, but I want to share it as a framework. So much of our work comes from the recognition that there's a reciprocal relationship between abuse and economic hardship. So in other words, we know that domestic violence leads to poverty for many survivors, economic hardship resulting from the abuse, and then that economic hardship in turn exposes survivors to increased vulnerability to violence in the future. One of the pieces of our work has also involved taking a critical look at the long-term economic ripple effect of domestic violence. And so not just looking at discrete instances of economic hardship, but rather thinking about how economic impacts impede survivors' safety over the life course in very real ways. So while it may be an individual economic harm that occurs, we know that over the life course there are long-term mental health effects, obstructed professional development, obstructed access to employment, and increased vulnerability that require solutions that are targeting profound economic hardship over the life course and happening not just in terms of individual advocacy, but also systems change. One of the things that we also know is that the data tells us, and our experience working with advocates and survivors tells us, that regardless of an individual's race, access to economic resources are the most critical determinant of long-term safety. And so all of that has provided some of the backdrop of our work. CSAJ's work in the field recently has primarily been taking place through our Consumer Rights for Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors Initiative, which is a national project that's been around since 2007 and has focused on building the capacity of individual lawyers, individual advocacy by lawyers and advocates in the field, as well as forging partnerships. And one of the things that we have learned, because our focus has primarily been on working with, on the individual level and working with communities. So for example, some of our demonstration site work, while it's been useful in terms of organizational change, it's really unveiled for us some of the systemic barriers that survivors face. And it's that systemic and structural change analysis that led us to the need for some of the thinking around this REEP project. We know that there are significant racial disparities in domestic violence and sexual assault. So I present these to you as facts that we all know in our work, but is helpful to kind of center as we think about the need for and possibilities for change. So we know that women of color experience higher rates of domestic violence and sexual assault than their white counterparts. We know that people of color live in poverty at a rate disproportionate to whites, 27% versus 10%. We know that poverty has compounding and reciprocal effects. And we know that access to economic resources, as I had mentioned before, is critical. So when we put all those things together, it presents us with two key questions, which are, what are the concrete economic structural barriers facing survivors of color? And what strategies are needed to remove those systemic barriers in order to create access to the economic opportunities necessary for safety? So today we're going to talk about how that's translated into our Racial and Economic Equity for Survivors project. These are the objectives of our call today: an increased understanding of REEP's project purpose and activities, a general understanding of race equity approaches, a connection with a community of violence against women and race equity advocates to work that you all can work with as you strategize approaches. And also, hopefully you'll be equipped with approaches that aid in identifying and addressing the systemic barriers facing survivors in your community to consider and see whether or not they fit with the incredible work that you're already doing. So with all of that as background, I'd like to hand the program over to Lisa Lynn Jacobs.
And this is Sarah, just gonna jump in. Hallie, if you can hear me, can you introduce yourself really quick?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, this is Hallie Bonger-White from the Southwest Center for Law and Policy.
We're so thrilled to have you. Just wanted to
Thank
make
you for
sure
having
that
us.
we could hear you, and Lisa Lynn will take it away and loop you back in right now.
Thank you.
Lisa Lynn, you should have control. If you just click the screen, go for it.
I can't hear Lisa Lynn.
Thank you. Very helpful to unmute before one begins their presentation. And a very timely place to begin, because what I was about to say was it may be true of both our panelists and our participants, but as others have been speaking, I've been hearing a little bit of background noise and a little bit of conversation. So if you look, I believe, and Sarah's far more facile about this than I, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you should find a box that you can click to mute yourself. And I would urge everyone, whether or not they have a speaking role or not, to do that, just so that we keep the atmospheric noise to a minimum. Great, so good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Lisa Lynn Jacobs. I am the Legal and Policy Director for the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, and I am excited to be a part of the first webinar that we are putting on with respect to the Legal Impact for Racial and Economic Equity of Survivors project. Yes, that is a mouthful. For that reason, we affectionately refer to the project by REEP. That is its acronym. What I'm going to do this afternoon is to give you a little bit of a sense of the various pieces of the project. And then I am going to facilitate a bit of a discussion with one set of REEP's partners. The thing that I want to share at the outset as I begin to talk about race and racial equity is that all of the partners who you will be hearing from this afternoon have experience with and have worked with racial equity tools in the context of their work. The only distinction to be made between the two is that the set of partners I'm going to be talking with use these tools in the context of their work in communities of color as they work with communities that are dealing with issues around sexual and domestic violence. And after I wrap up, I'm going to turn things over to Camille Holmes, who's going to have a discussion with our other partners who work on this issue from the standpoint of academia or from the way that they approach these issues in their work as lawyers. But having said that, I'm going to turn over to, one moment, please. Okay, experiencing technical difficulties. Give me just one moment here. Sarah, it may be more efficient if you can do it to have you.
Sure. Just let me know.
Sure.
When you want to move through.
Sure. That would be terrific. So starting here, the purpose of the REEP program is to address barriers of discrimination. And I have a paren here that I want to pause and talk about for a minute, because we've been fortunate enough to get a sense of where our audience is. We know that people come to this work from a variety of places, as advocates, as lawyers, from legal aid, and who deal with these issues from a number of standpoints. So just to re-emphasize that discrimination really has two faces, if you will. One we tend to call intentional discrimination, and the other we can call discrimination that happens not so much by intent, but by effect. If I am making a determination that I'm not going to hire women or not going to hire people of color, or I refuse to interview anyone who I believe may be a member of the LGBT community or who has a disability, that is intentional discrimination. But if I'm an employer and I make distinctions between how I treat different classes of employees, for instance, if I give different types of privileges, like the ability to earn time and a half, but I give that only to employees who work full-time versus those who work part-time, that could be discrimination by effect. It becomes discrimination by effect if my part-time workforce is comprised primarily of women and people of color. Because what I have done, in effect, is to create privileges for one group of people, but not for a second readily identifiable group of people. So just to go back to having offered that distinction, I'm going to take us back to the definition at this point. REEP is looking at both sets of those issues, looking at the barriers created by discrimination, whether that discrimination occurs by intent or by effect. It is also its intention is also to look at institutional bias and structural oppression with a goal of enhancing access to economic justice for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So often in the work that I have done in this field over the years, and particularly in the last several years since the NFL case involving Ray and Janae Rice, you hear people ask the question so frequently, why didn't the survivor leave? Why didn't the survivor leave? And the answer to that is individual, it's unique as to any particular survivor, but the answer often lands in the realm of the economic issue, whether or not that person is or is not working and therefore dependent on the perpetrator's resources. And so for that reason, REEP is focusing on the ways in which access to economic justice can be enhanced if we dig more deeply into these structural issues, more deeply into these issues of discrimination as a way of removing those barriers, particularly for survivors of color. Next slide, please, Sarah. Thank you. So REEP, as you can see here, the project includes a number of pieces. I've included them all here, and then I'm going to walk you relatively quickly through a set of slides that talk about each of the pieces individually. So the component parts are the National Impact Agenda, the survey assessment, which is also part of the National Impact Agenda, the impact sites, the equity webinar series, the Survivor Story Corp, and Race Equity Resource Library. So those are the key component parts of the project. Next slide, please, Sarah. So as you can see here, this is sort of a slide that helps you to understand, if you will, the way in which the National Impact Agenda is going to get unpacked. It's going to begin with an impact assessment, which I will talk about in a moment, and some other pieces of it will include listening sessions where I think different parts of the advocacy community, whether or not it's advocates or legal aid or other particular groups, will have an opportunity to share their particular experiences in working with survivors of color and talking about the particular challenges that that universe of survivors experienced, particularly with regard to economics issues. A component part of that will be strategy calls. And finally, that will culminate in a National Strategic Impact Agenda report. And the goal of the report is to provide tools to folks like the people who have gathered with us on the call today. The goal is to harness the material that we will get from the communities that our partners work in, from our partners in this work, and then ultimately to be able to send back to the field, as we often call it, tools and resources so that future work can be informed, if you will, by what we have discovered in the work of the agenda and in the work of the assessment. Next slide, please, Sarah. So the assessment itself will have a couple of areas that it will be looking at. We'll be looking at issues around whether or not survivors who are marginalized on the basis of their race, their ethnicity, their political status, their place, their legal status, how does that universe of survivors experience barriers, and particularly economic barriers, which are different, and barriers to safety, which are different than white survivors. We'll also look at the question of whether or not these challenges require or necessitate specialized solutions that acknowledge the fact that those differences, whether or not they are related to race or gender identity or others, may create the need for specialized solutions by way of response. We will also be asking questions about what these strategies and what communities are using. We'll look to communities to share with us what strategies they're using in their goals and their aspirations to respond to issues around racial and economic inequity for survivors. We have piloted the impact assessment. It will be released shortly. And after the release date, which we will hope to share with you, I would say within the next month or so, that's our goal. After that release date, 6 weeks later, the impact assessment will conclude, and we will begin to compile and look closely at that data to see what it tells us about next steps and about strategies that we can ultimately share in the report. Next slide, please. Also, as a part of the REEP program or project, we're going to be working with 2 impact sites. In order to determine geographically and otherwise what impact sites to work with, we relied heavily on the counsel and advice of our REEP partners to try to identify organizations working on the ground in communities of color, and organizations that, as I described earlier, but very much like our REEP partners, were already working in community and working using racial equity strategies, working to respond to the ways in which race might cause an additional or pose an additional barrier or challenge for particular communities. We have identified 2 target sites. We are sort of working through the process of dotting the I's and crossing the T's with them, so we will be announcing them shortly. Once we have begun formally that work with them, we are going to go into a 4-phase project, which begins with gathering voices and doing planning. That will include a number of calls with those particular sites and hearing from them about what their goals are and trying to figure out ways in which the strengths and the historic work that our partners have done in these areas might complement or help to enhance the work that the impact sites are doing. The thing that I shared when I talked to groups that we spoke to in the process of determining who might be a good impact site, the thing that I want to point out and share on the call is this. We recognize that the folks that we talk to in the impact site context are experts already. They're already using the racial equity techniques. Our thought was that in addition to bringing to the table our domestic and sexual violence experts and sharing with the impact sites the work that they did and the ways in which they used racial equity tools, our thought was that the addition of people in academia and people who work for legal aid or people who otherwise work in the law who have also used racial equity tools might provide the opportunity to put some other tools on the table which might be relevant to consider. Might not at the end of the day, but we wanted to offer a broad array of tools and options for our impact site partners to consider. So phase 2 would include advocacy and looking at litigation and policy strategies. Phase 3 would be a forum where we actually went to the impact sites and worked with them and others that they chose to pull into the project, perhaps their coalition partners in the communities and others, to try and use the tools that our partners use to enhance or lift up or provide additional ways of working in the communities. And then finally, in phase 4, there would be the opportunity for reflection, for strategic learning. And I also want to say that at various points, the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice has a history of working with impact, or sometimes we call them demonstration sites. One of the terrific ways in which we have done this work is to actually bring the demonstration sites together so that they can learn from each other and talk about what did and what did not work. And so that would be part of the phase 4 reflection and strategic learning as well. Next slide, please, Sarah. We are also, and this is the first of those, we are also going to, as part of this project, put on a race equity webinar series. This is the first one, which will provide the folks who have joined us today with an overview, with an introduction to our partners. Then in about 2 months, on March 23rd, our second webinar will take place, and that will dig more deeply into some of the issues around racial equity and looking at it in the context of safety. In late May, we will do the first of 2 webinars with our partners and with a subset of our partners to look particularly at advocacy issues and the way that they do the work that they do. The first of those webinars will include the Women of Color Network and Casa de Esperanza. And the second of those webinars will take place on June 29th. We'll also focus on advocacy issues, but in that one, that will involve a partnership with the AP, the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and the Southwest Center on Law and Policy. In late August, on the 24th, our next webinar will look at racial equity issues in practice. And at that point, we are hopeful that our impact sites will that at this point we will have gone there, that we will have done the learning and some of the work, sort of a big chunk of the work with them at that point, after they've, as I said initially, identified what their goals are, and we figured out ways in which we can be supportive of that. So the August webinar will involve the 2 demonstration sites talking about that work, what it looked like, what the collaboration looked like, learning from that, etc. And then in late October, on the 26th, we will take a look at the National Strategic Impact Agenda and look at impact strategies and ways to advance a race equity approach. Next slide, please, Sarah. So moving relatively quickly, because I want to get to the part of the presentation where we're in dialogue with our partners, the REEP project will also include a Survivor Story Corp and Race Equity Legal Resource Library. The purpose of the Story Corp is to document survivor stories so that those are available for training purposes, for understanding how to develop and build out programs, and to bring about systems change in terms of the work that's being targeted at systemic inequality. The resource library will be an online library designed to house a specialized collection of legal and policy strategic impact resources, whether or not those are policy briefs, case law, legal papers, journal articles, training guides, mapping tools, other kinds of resources that people who are interested in looking at or working more closely on the race equity front might review to figure out how to better understand and engage with that work. Next slide, please, Sarah. So I am now going to turn to a discussion with our partners listed here: the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Casa de Esperanza, the Southwest Center for Law and Policy, the Texas Council on Family Violence, and the Women of Color Network, Inc. A word or two about these partners, I think, is in order and important. These partners are engaged in the intersectional work in the sexual assault and domestic violence sphere. Their work acknowledges and responds to the ways in which a survivor's race, political status, gender identity can shape their interaction with systems. Those systems can include law enforcement, courts, other parts of state or federal entities, and that identity also informs and contributes to the experience of a survivor with respect to their experience of oppression, of racism, of ableism, of heterosexism, and of other identities that a survivor carries with him or her on a daily basis. The work of responding to how these systems and structures affect and impact survivors of color is racial equity work, and something that these partners are actively engaged in, whether it is called racial equity work or something else. I now want to turn it over to our partners to discuss the principles of their work and examples of the work that they do. So I'm going to throw it open, and as my partners know, they should either volunteer or in a moment or two, I'm going to call on someone. Tanya, do you want to go ahead?
I was just getting geared up. You saw me. Hi, can you can hear me?
Yep.
Great. That mute button is sometimes the hurdle to jump over. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanya Lovelace Davis, and I am the CEO for Women of Color Network, Inc. Today, I'm joined as well by Purvi Shah, who is a senior consultant with Women of Color Network, and she will join in this discussion. I will be laying out principles of Women of Color Network's work, and then Purvi will speak to examples in the way in which we do this work. I will do this work, I will do my presentation on sort of two levels. First, I'll talk about the organizations sort of undergirding the way that we do our work as an organization, and then get more specific into our economic policy and leadership work, which is the reason I believe and the way in which we've connected very closely with CSAJ in their project. And so the Women of Color Network's mission is to eliminate violence against all women by centralizing the voices and the leadership of women of color and their communities. And when we speak of women of color, we're speaking of those who are of Asian, African, Latin, Middle Eastern, and Native descent. We also do this work with the purpose to work beyond the fields of domestic and sexual violence. And so while we come to this table as survivors, as advocates, as activists around domestic and sexual violence, it's very clear to us that we need to look at a broad range of issues that intersect and connect with these issues, including such issues as human trafficking, as police brutality and over-incarceration, and much of the ways that Lisa mentioned. And so we really are looking at a global context of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, and other forms of oppression that again intersects and really collide to create barriers and challenges for communities of color. The ways in which we, sort of the trajectory in which, and the ways, sort of the goals in which we do our work is really to provide women of color and marginalized populations access to information that they might not otherwise receive through various forms of leadership training and mentor work that we do, as well as other projects that create opportunities for marginalized communities and women of color to gain access to this information. We work to challenge systems and institutions that create barriers for women of color and marginalized communities, barriers that stand in the way of them achieving violence-free lives. We promote the development of independent, women of color-led, and programs that are led by marginalized populations that are more likely to reach marginalized communities. And so we work hard to lift up those efforts. And then finally, we examine local, state, federal, and tribal policies and provide opportunities for women of color and marginalized communities to organize and exercise their voice regarding these issues, and to ensure that they're able to speak from the body, from their personal and professional experiences, as well as community issues as well. When it comes to our economic policy and leadership work, we've really been building that work probably since the beginning of Women of Color Network, since we've been around since 1997. We've always centralized issues when welfare got reshaped to TANF, and various other factors were happening. WOCN Inc. Has been really closely involved with those issues and have partnered with many national and local advocates and activists to address these issues. And then in 2010, we formalized a project, which is our Economic Policy and Leadership Project, where we really focus on taking economic issues, policy issues, and leadership issues, and linking those together, ensuring that we can support those advocates of color that are doing economic policy work, that are doing violence against women work, and other social justice work, to create spaces for them to come together so that we can have a unified approach in the ways in which we do this work, and to break down silos. Really, the aim is to further a safety net for all survivors, and to create voices for our communities, and to lead that vision despite the violence and inequality of our communities, and to ensure that we are then able to gather together and to create resources that will entitle economic security and a voice every table for women of color in their communities, and to support and uplift safety and health across our communities as well. We believe that innovative practices are really what is going to assist in transforming the lives of marginalized communities. And sometimes that means lifting up practices that we've always done. So sometimes it's not always innovative, it's lifting up things that we've always done and presenting that as viable practices, as well as in to create and reshape and to shape practices that will more specifically meet our communities. Women of Color Network, within the presence of historical oppressions, current challenges that we're experiencing, as we all know, around economy and political environments, we seek to ensure that economic security challenges facing women of color and Indigenous women and survivors are examined and are addressed so that all survivors can be supported and reached effectively. And so we do this by a number of different ways. We hold regional meetings, we hold national conferences, and we also do, we provide resources that we think are useful. We do webinars. We also develop reports to the field and various different measures that we take in order to support this. I will pass it then to Porvi to provide examples in the ways in which we do this work.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanya. That was great. And thank you to CSAJ for this valuable webinar and project. I'm so excited to be part of it. And thank you to all my sisters, brothers, and non-binary relatives on the call today. I want to affirm that our work is life-saving, even when we get messages that are different. So thank you for all the work you do every day. I'm building on what Tanya talked about in terms of how we enable access to information. One of the ways that we do that is enabling policy convening for advocates, working with survivors of color and Indigenous survivors. At those convenings, we talk through, as Erica mentioned at the top, the ways in which economic inequity links to violence in our lives. And so, for example, that includes discussing the wage gap and gender pay inequity, where Latina women get 54 cents to the dollar as compared to white men, or how women with disabilities get 75 cents to what men with disabilities get as what men with disabilities get. So kind of laying out some of those economic realities in our lives, in addition to the linkages to the fact that 1 in 2 Indigenous women will report sexual violence in their lifetime. So how do these things relate? Or as Cecilia Chung of the Transgender Law Center talks through in their 2015 national survey of trans individuals living with HIV, that 43% of respondents make less than $12,000 per year, and 41% indicate a history of incarceration. So the data is the first piece of what we do in terms of gathering folks and really talking about the structures and the larger frameworks of our lives. And then, as Tanya mentioned, what we do is then speak from the body in order to challenge systems and institutions. We do that by centering our analysis and expanding the definition of safety and security with our voices and experiences in order to promote and enable a policy that truly addresses our needs. So as my sister Elise Moore-Orby also at the Women of Color Network describes, we not only talk about intimate partner violence, but the violence that threads through our lives. So in one way, we talk about that as poverty as a form of violence, or as Linda Eagle, speaker, has mentioned at one of our trainings, as a nation, we create poverty by telling women you must live on just as much with public benefit. We also do that by showing the structural powers and laying that bare. So for example, as Azadeh Shah-Shahani mentioned, talking about how immigrant detention is part of mass incarceration of people of color, noting that there's a 34,000 bed quota of detained immigrants, and that this quota is arbitrary except for the profit made by corporations. So these linkages tying the individual to the political to the structural are part of what we enable at our gatherings, and then enabling intersectional solutions and really creating solutions from our own experiences. So that could be examples like Lillian Wicca, who speaks about the Incarcerated Parents Project, which recognizes that 1 in 9 Black children has an incarcerated parent, and that we need to advocate for supportive policies such as visitation rooms in jails, parenting classes, and a focus on reunification as opposed to adoption. So we also, in the biggest frame, while we're advocating for policies that center our experiences, are working through our gatherings and bringing movements together. And we do this in order to decolonize our movements. We know that, for example, civil rights movements, racial justice movements, even labor rights movements have often marginalized the voice of women and gender issues. And so in doing so, we bring together and break these silos and ensure that gender is part of the work that we're doing. As Marcia Olivo at the Miami Workers Center has noted, that she's done economic justice work her whole life, and gender has not been at the center of that conversation. So working together with advocates across social justice, economic justice, and gender violence spheres, we're working to decolonize our movements and ensure that gender is part of our conversations. So at our 2011 summit, we talked about secure communities, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and how we can work with domestic workers and nail salon workers to ensure that violence, intimate partner violence, is part of also the conversation around labor rights, civil rights, and immigrant rights. One way that we do this very concretely, and I'll end with this in terms of our vision, is that our vision is enacting policies that enable structural equity and self-experience of building power through love, spirit, and interdependence. And for example, Grace Franklin at the Oklahoma City Artists for Justice embodies part of this experience with her collective in terms of fighting for justice in the Daniel Holtzclaw case, in terms of recognizing disproportionate impact of sexual violence in communities of color and how to enable justice in unjust structures. And I'll end with a comment from L. Hearns, who talks about how healing should center work on violence, and we need to create opportunities for love. So at our work with the Women of Color Network, as we gather advocates, as we speak from the body in our experiences, we want to make sure that we're offering intersectional solutions as well as a vision for what justice, equity, and actual safety and security for our communities would look like.
Thank you, Porvi. There's one last thing I want to add to that, in that we centralize healing in this work. And so while on top of experiencing and recognizing that we're speaking from the body and the experiences impact the body, mind, and spirit, we're also engaging in healing work. We've been holding Jagged Justice phone calls, which is another conversation that really links high profile issues and political environments and other concerns, and linking them to the ways in which we experience domestic and sexual violence in our communities, and really centralizing healing as a part of that. And almost every piece of work that we do comes back to the concept of healing, as we are not just structurally disempowered, but we generally are in pain regarding this disempowerment. And so this is something that we're also engaged quite a bit in. Thank you so much, Lisa Lynn, for giving us an opportunity to speak.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tanya and Porvi. Next, we're going to go to Pierre Beristain from the Casa de Esperanza. Pierre, are you ready and unmuted?
I am ready and muted and visible. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And, and I know that you wanted this to be a little interactive. So in order to kind of promote that, if you guys like what I say, then say yay on the chat, or very cool, or anything that you want. And then if you don't like something, just send me a private message, and and I'll reply. Or if something isn't clear, please ask, and I'll definitely kind of reply on the chat. So that'd be great, because that gives me an idea as to like where people are and where we're missing the mark, so that it's not just a monologue but a dialogue. to some degree. So in terms of the principles at Casa de Esperanza and the National Latino Network, there are so many, right, that kind of lift up our work. And one of them is that everything that we do is from the ground up and community. And I think it becomes really easy for organizations to say everything's from the ground up, it's all about community. But one of the ways that we live up to that at the national level as a national organization is that we still operate a local programming in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis. And so we have a domestic violence shelter that does not only do domestic violence work, but also community engagement work, which is very different, we believe, from community outreach. Community outreach falls under the idea of here is the information to community, and community takes it, and if they like it, great. If they don't, then they leave it behind. Community engagement for us is a primary principle, kind of like a bedrock of what we do. And it says that we have community as a co-driver or a co-pilot in the work that we're doing. And so through listening sessions, through assessments, through feedback mechanisms, we get information as to what the community wants, what the community needs, what they want. And then we do our work based on that, or we do programming, we do public policy or research based on everything that the community gives us. And so when we say community, obviously I'm talking about the local work that we do in the Twin Cities, but also as a national organization, all the information and all the relationships that we've built over the year throughout the United States and Latin America, to get information from what's happening on the ground in terms of best practices, research, public policy, and some challenges and successes that we have in the field. So one of the pillars that we have at Casa de Esperanza is that community guides our work, and the tool that we use for that really is the community engagement model. So that is one part that I wanted to share with folks. We also have the idea that a lot of these issues originate or take place in the context of community. So that's why it's so important that we involve communities. But that is not to say that we leave systems unaccountable, right? I think all of us here work within systems, and especially around these times, if I may be kind of ambiguous, it becomes increasingly important for us to work in the context of systems and in holding systems accountable. And so to that end, the way that we end up doing that is by fostering or forming coalitions and really believing in the power of relationships. And I think that can be done at the national level, and we also see it done at the local level in so many ways. So to give an example, there are many cases in which police departments have children translate for the parents, right, in cases of domestic violence, or children are acting as interpreters. And we found that happened throughout the United States with different entities. And the organizations that have responded or engaged systems have been able to do it because of a history of a relationship with that police department. So they will have relationships with officers, they'll have relationships with the DV, the domestic violence victims unit, with the sheriff's department. And so folks, advocates are able to send a letter, to send a quick email that say, very quick, this is why this is not great practice. And something as simple as that can only happen, one, if relationships were fostered from the beginning, and we truly invest time in fostering our networks, and two, if we are also willing to take information from these systems as well. So the police is able to tell us this is what works, this is what doesn't work, and we're able to tell them the same, and then there is this open line. Now, for many of you, when I say this, it's like, well, duh. Of course, we're supposed to work in systems. Of course, we're supposed to foster relationships. And the reality is that so many of us who are doing direct services get caught up in direct services because that is the crisis. That is the immediate need, right? That is what we're funded to do. And oftentimes the engagement with systems, the relationship building, is left to a second platform, not out of because we want to, but out of just necessity. And so one of the challenges for us as a field that is always responding to crisis, always engaging in conflict resolution, is to figure out ways to make space, to make some time for us to see how we can engage systems. And it also makes our work easier when we have a number of partners engaged, then more people kind of take accountability. So that's a little bit of the approach that we take on the ground. And to finish, just to give everybody who is not familiar with Casa de Esperanza's work, we approach this from a really a four-faceted or four-layered access points, if you will. Public policy, so we have a public policy initiative that works in Washington and at the national level, and also at state levels, providing some public policy recommendations as well as analyses. We have a research team that does work at the national level on the intersection of identity and so many of the issues that we care about. We have a training and technical assistance team that works with organizations, entities, universities around the crimes, including domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and human trafficking. And we also have a communications team that is in charge of campaigns, social media, et cetera, et cetera. And really, they all work together to kind of raise awareness, engage in prevention, and engage in intervention practices. So I hope that covers what you wanted, Lisa Lynn. If it doesn't, please let me know, and I'll be happy to expand. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Pierre. And just doing a time check, we are at 8 minutes after 2. We are running a bit long. I'm going to turn to the next of our sexual or domestic violence partners for whoever wishes to jump in next, and ask that if possible, you could shorten your presentation just a little bit because we need to also turn to our legal and academic partners as well. Thanks.
This is Hallie. Is it time for me, perhaps?
Please,
All right.
You have the
I'm
floor.
going to jump right in. Good afternoon, my fellow relatives and other people on this call who are interested in providing safety and justice for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I'm Hallie Bongar-White. I'm with the Southwest Center for Law and Policy, and we are a training and technical assistance provider for OVW, for American Indian, Alaska Native tribes and dependent communities. I'm a lawyer. I'm also a Safe Star and a victim advocate. I'm also a mother, a grandmother, an auntie, a niece. I really like what Pierre talked about, relationships, because in Indian country, for American Indian, Alaska Native women, safety depends upon relationships. Relationships with one another, with our families, with our friends, with our communities, professional relationships. Many of you may not have the consciousness that where you are sitting today in your office, whether it be in Ohio or New York or Texas, you're on occupied lands. For many American Indian and Alaska Native peoples, this is really not about race. This is about the political relationship with the United States as occupiers, as colonizers, and there are rights that are able to be litigated in court to things like healthcare, having adequately funded criminal justice systems with jails and law enforcement officers and prosecutors and courts. There are rights to education, and many of these stem from the federal trust responsibility, which in itself is paternalistic and racist, because it is based upon the premise that the United States is the guardian to Indian people who do not have the capacity to govern themselves. It's a government-to-government relationship, and when we're talking about economic justice, we're talking about enforcement of treaty rights, both treaties between the United States government and tribes, and also tribes as beneficiaries to international treaties, such as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives tribes on the United States-Mexican border, along with the Gadsden Purchase, the ability to move unimpeded across the U.S.-Mexico border with their goods and services and their cattle and their livestock. So it's slightly different, and also the language that it's used in tribal communities, which are mostly rural, poor communities. When we're discussing this, the language is very, very different. And so even though I'm educated and I'm a lawyer and I got all these degrees and such, I have to do translation in my head when I'm listening to all of you speak. And so I see that as a challenge in building these very, very important relationships, because we need you just, during these times, we all need one another. We have to support one another. We have to use our compassion and the energy that Creator has given us to lift each other up. When you're working on economic justice issues with Native people, we're talking about things like forced sterilization until the 1970s. It's more of a sense that of being occupied, of being at war, of being ripped off. It's a different, it's almost, I use the analogy of we're all at the Cineplex and we've all bought our tickets to go see a movie, but it's a slightly different movie that we're watching in Indian country. And that's where American Indian Alaska Native women have the highest rates of sexual violence of any population, the highest rates of domestic violence, the highest rates of stalking, the highest rates of violent crime victimization, the highest rates of the firearm being used against them, the highest rates of an injury sustained as a result of sexual violence, the highest rates of gang rape of any population, the highest rates of a firearm being used against Native women, and that when Native women are sexually assaulted, it's particularly violent and causes tremendous amounts of physical injury that often require medical care or hospitalization. So I would say that the sense that people have in Indian country is that we're in solidarity with you, but we also are at war. We do not have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit domestic violence and sexual assault, except for a handful of tribes that are Tribal Law and Order Act compliant, which is very expensive, and only the wealthiest tribes, gaming tribes and such, can do that. So if the majority of sexual assault and domestic violence perpetrators are non-Native, and the statistics show that they are that the victims indicate that they're white males, and you don't have basic criminal jurisdiction and there's no criminal consequences for perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence, that becomes a priority. That becomes a rallying cry. That becomes like very, very basic. We're not even talking about economic justice. We're talking about safety for ourselves and our daughters and our granddaughters and our families. So I just wanted to just highlight a couple of the differences that we have with the populations that we serve, and to also mention it's the highest rate of unemployment in the country, with many Indian reservations having 80% unemployment, not uncommon. So I wanted to just insert some of those little tidbits of information, some of those little differences, and to also make a plea that we need to reach across. You know, we're really isolated, and our urban brothers and sisters, sometimes we don't have a lot of contact with you to be able to join with you and to be able to find our points of commonality and work together. And so my prayer for today is that this is the initial steps, or some of the initial steps to working across the country with all of our relations, all of our relatives, to try to increase economic justice and justice in general for all survivors of violent crime victimization and violence against women, transgender people, LGBTQ people, two-spirit people, elders, teens, persons with disabilities, that we want to join with you. There is some struggle with finding a common language, and also in framing the issues, not as the United States government as a colonizer who has reneged on their treaty obligations and continues to be at war with Native people. If we can also find those other points of commonality with you, we're not focused on that, and it would be good to be focused on some of those issues with you. So I just want to put that out with you, and I thank you very much for being able to participate in this conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much, Hallie. API or Texas Coalition, can you help us wrap up here?
Hi, this is Sarah with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. I just wanted to say thank you to Hallie. That was very powerful, and that also made me think a little bit about thanking my other co-panelists before. One part of me just wants to say so that the Texas folks also get a chance, like, thank you, Pierre, Tanya, and Purvi, you made my presentation, but I just want to add about us. We are a national resource center, and we primarily work with the smallest or the model minority, the Asian and Pacific Islanders, who make up less than 10% of the population, but we also represent a huge, diverse continent. Asia is huge, and then you can throw in the Hawaiian and the islands and Pacific territories, and trying to work and come to some sort of commonality within this population are things that we ourselves constantly struggle with. I think the other piece of it is, which has been addressed, I believe, by Purvi, about that gender justice is things that we don't talk about. I wanted to also throw out that Asians are also considered to be folks that make the same amount of money as white people, so may not always end up being spoken about when we talk about Black and Latina populations. But within the Asian population, there is a huge discrepancy or dichotomy about, there's one lot that makes a lot of, is economically very well off, and one lot that's not. Our principles at the AP Institute on Gender-Based Violence are based on building the power of those most marginalized. And we do that through policy work, we do that through advocacy for the agencies that do work in the ground. We end up working with them, and the way we do that is pretty much all staff at the institute have relationships or have been former executive directors and direct line staff at the agencies, and so we kind of have our hands to the ground as well. We have folks who partner with other agencies. We provide technical assistance and trainings across a broad range of topics, including the difference between intimate partner violence, state violence, and then violence, for example, that is perpetuated by someone who you're not intimate with. And the struggle, that the cultural implications of whether you are in this country in a documented manner or an undocumented manner, how that plays out across different different spheres of the system. And trying to do language advocacy, I think that has been one of our backbones of the work that the Institute has been doing. Our ITAC program works with not just agencies, but also across all agencies, but also with the systems. So I think I will stop there so that the Texas folks can go.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. Mona, are you ready to wrap us up? We are a little over time, so if you could share, although share briefly, that would be terrific.
Absolutely, thank you. So I'll just start off by saying that my name is Mona Monroe with the Texas Council on Family Violence, and we do, as just to point out a difference, Texas TCFV is the only state coalition that is a REEP partner, and so the lens in which we'll be talking about our work is from a state focus, which gives us a very unique perspective to offer as a partner on the REEP call. Much like all the other organizations that have talked today, we have those focus areas on the intersection of domestic violence, economic justice work, and equity. What I would say very quickly to echo some of the comments that have been made, first and foremost is that in Texas, we find that domestic violence programs are doing this work, but they may not necessarily be identifying that work. And so we might be calling economic justice work, case management, or budgeting, or micro lending, or housing work, or financial literacy work. And they're also doing a lot of this intersectional work of the domestic violence, equity, and economic justice piece. That usually is reflected, much like Pierre mentioned earlier, through the lens of examining access to services, language access, for example, via courts, and then also looking at how policy proportionally or disproportionately affects people of color. So I would say that's one of the pieces, and I would highlight that that language is probably one of the biggest forms of support and things that we've learned at the coalition level to be able to say that the work programs are doing is financial literacy. For example, it is financial literacy work, but it is actual economic justice work. To say that programs are doing equity work, and in addition to highlight the intersection. And I would say that maybe as important is to really focus on that intersection so we can bring that commonality back to the fact that survivors are working within that system of the economic justice system and the equity system. And just to really quickly highlight a few of how some of this work happens in Texas, one of the most recent pieces of highlighting this intersection is TCFE's Beyond Screening Texas Health Summit. We hosted that last summer in August. And it was a statewide conference focused on policy recommendations from a domestic violence task force, emphasizing approaches to domestic violence among pregnant women and new mothers. And really our role there was to be able to be a partner in hosting all different stakeholders and highlighting, for example, speakers from the Center of Elimination of Disproportionality and Disparities out of the Texas State Health Services. And they offered that insight and really brought to light the intersection of equity and economic justice and highlighted those tools that they were using. Additionally, just yesterday, we hosted a webinar that identified the intersections of taxes and health insurance for domestic violence survivors, which really explored the financial implications, the benefits of the tax code, identifying the protections available through the tax code, while also identifying that the policy has different financial implications for married, single, and undocumented survivors. And what that does is really bring to light those unequitable tax policies that are out there and that survivors are and will be very soon, obviously with tax season onset, experiencing. And so this allows us kind of, in final words, at a statewide level to amplify this work to our stakeholders, but also brings to the consciousness of us as well as our statewide stakeholders the equity work that is currently happening and allows us to serve as that connecting voice to provide resources and to provide support to all the greater stakeholders in Texas, which is obviously a critical piece to our underlying mission.
Great. Thanks so much, Mona, and thanks to our audience for the terrific comments and feedback that we are getting as we go along. Just as an FYI, we have about 20 more minutes in terms of now turning it over to our academic and legal partners. Obviously, this being a webinar, the recording is going to be archived. We hope that you are able to remain with us for the remainder of the presentation, but if not, we will make sure that you get access to a link so that you can see the rest of this terrific programming. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Camille Holmes. Camille.
Great. Hello, everyone. How are you? You can answer me by chat. First, I just want to say that I am so excited to hear this conversation and to hear the voices of all the presenters and partners on this presentation. I'm honored to be in this space with you and feel privileged to walk this journey with you. I am consulting with the Center for Survivor Access and Agency and Justice, and I want to talk a little bit before I introduce the other set of partners about the conversation that we just had. And before I even do that, I want to tee up, I think, Sarah, if you could tee up the poll so we can get a sense of where people are coming from. Right.
Yes, so everyone should see a poll pop up.
Great. So the panelists asked if you're a grantee of the Office on Violence Against Women. And if you could just check the box, we'll wait and see where everyone lays, where this group lays out. I can't tell if it's calculating. You let me know, Sarah, when that's done.
Yeah, I can give you a little live feedback while we're giving folks time. Looks like we got a lot of LAV folks, a lot of other. So if you receive other OVW grantees, please type it into the chat and let us know what programs you're a part of. Then we've also got some good and even distribution across some of these other class, rural, underserved. And if you do not receive funding, let us know kind of what you do and what you're interested in. Any other feedback for our panelists?
Great. So while you're filling that out, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll move the poll over so there I can go. I can see the rest of the group. I was to start with the question of why racial equity, and I think that question, if you haven't heard it, has been answered. I'll say it again. I think everyone has said it: to stop intentional discrimination, to stop discrimination in fact, to stop structural oppression across race, gender, ethnicity, LGBTQ status. And so maybe the real question is, why should I be on this webinar? What can I get? There it is. And so we have 6% of the group is from culturally specific culturally specific domestic violence and sexual assault organizations, 31% from legal assistance, 17% rural, 6% state territorial coalition, 2% tribal, 10% underserved, 27% other, and another not an OVW grantee, which is 27%. Great. And so that question of where we're from, where we're starting this conversation is really important. The language that we heard in this call is very unfamiliar for perhaps the folks who are in legal aid organizations. I can imagine coming into a couple of meetings that I've been, and I've come out of the legal aid community and have worked at the intersections of civil rights, legal services, and racial justice organizations as a connector and thinker. That conversation, you see a lot of blank stares. You see people really getting into it, but not knowing, not having the same language to share from the inside, like from an authentic place, from a learned place. And for some people it's there, but for a lot of folks, it's the question is, what can I do? What tools can you give me? How can I make this real? How do I make this fit into my work? And that is some of the challenge that we face with cross-sector work. And I don't want to, I'm painting bright lines. We all know that it's more complex and nuanced than that. But what's fascinating and fun about this work is that it is a process of, one, building relationships, building trust, and then two, learning to hear, not only to listen to one another, but to hear one another. Because in order to find spaces where we can work together effectively and also honor the existing movements, the existing theoretical frameworks, the existing practices, we have to observe, connect, trust, articulate what our backgrounds are and what we're actually doing, so that we can not offend
unnecessarily, and we cannot miss these opportunities to connect. I read an article about the Women's March recently, and there were a couple of articles. One article was talking about who wasn't there, and the other article was talking about how can we move past our anger at everything that's happening right now, our frustration, people's fears, people feeling that they are under threat, and that their threat is the most important threat in this moment, because that's very real. That's in the body, as someone said before. How can we move through that to invite people into that conversation and to recognize where folks are just not, they don't have the same background. They may not be coming from the same place of either learning, study, experience, and providing openings for that. So I say that before turning to Kip and Bill, because this is, I'm having flashbacks from being in meetings where you talk to folks who are working on the ground in communities, and what they need to know is that you respect them and that you will listen and that you honor their experience. And I'm on another meeting, and it's about developing your legal strategy, and what can you win? What can you do? We are operating within the limits of what we can achieve, and we don't want to hear about anything else because we don't have time or money to get that done. And we can imagine how quickly that clashes. So my statement about why racial equity, why do you want to focus on it based on where you're sitting from? If you're from a culturally specific organization, know that you have if you're talking like these people on the call, you have a depth of understanding that others may not have. If you are from a legal services or nonprofit law firm, or academic institution, you may have resources that others could use if they just felt that they could work with you, trust you, know that they're not going to be co-opted or dismissed. And then for, I'm going back through the list of folks. I think the other piece is we're not always going to be able to work with one another on everything, and that's okay. We have to choose what we're working on and make individual sort of personal, professional, organizational decisions about where we're going to show up, but we can all support through our language and our and the way we conduct ourselves, each other's humanity. The last piece I'll say, particularly about lawyers, and I think it was something that Purvi was saying about being in the body. Lawyers have a high suicide rate. We're taught to be disconnected from our bodies. And a lot of the legal services discussion on, and I'm speaking from where I've been, there are other perspectives that still may need to be represented, but the legal services conversation was about bringing, preserving, expanding the space within our community to allow people to reconnect to themselves, reconnect to community, and put race back on the table. And so we're coming at it from different ends, but I'm hopeful that we can meet in the middle, and or maybe over to one side, depending on who has the most capacity to speak through their anger, pain, and trauma to affect positive change. So I will stop there. I know we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to ask Kip Holly from the Kirwan Institute to introduce himself, and the questions are almost the same as for the other partners. Tell us a little bit about yourself, the principles of the work, and what you do.
Well, sure. Glad to be here with everybody. Just wonderful stuff today. My mind is still blown right now from what I've heard already. So thank you all. My name is Kip Holly. I am a research associate at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. My work is primarily in the work of civic engagement and social capital and how those interact with inequality. And basically, Kirwan is an applied research center that we work with communities all across the country to address, identify, and remediate racial equity and access to opportunity where it occurs. And we have two basic lenses of thinking about racial equity, which kind of describes our work and then the work we do here. One is we talk about racial inequity in terms of opportunity, access to opportunities to succeed. And this is everything from schools to healthcare to social services to economic opportunities. Who has access to those, who does not, and how do the way we make decisions play into those inequalities. And of course, we've seen, it won't come to any surprise, those inequalities tend to fall on race, gender, and income lines. So that's kind of what we do, and that's one of the things we use to see it. We also look through that kind of journey through three different lenses. We look at how race plays out in the mind, so race and cognition. That has a lot to do with implicit bias, if you've heard of that work. Things like racial stress, things like associations and implicit associations, and how those kind of prime us towards racially motivated and racially inequitable decision-making and engagement within policy-making and decision-making atmospheres in our communities, and how that kind of sets us up to have unequal engagement structures where some people are left out, depending on what the conversation looks like and where it's at, and how that ultimately leads to inequitable policy decisions, inequitable structures and systems, like we just talked about, in all sorts of ways. And so that's the basics of what we do. And we're just really excited to be on this journey because we see intimate partner violence as one of the places where, when we work with communities, everyone talks about the concentration, the lack of concentration of services, the lack of concentration, the lack of access to opportunity, the lack of can't get the word out. Attention, basically, for domestic intimate partner survivors of color, particularly women. We know that when inequality is talked about in a race sense, that it is compounded for women of color. Those inequalities are compounded. And so, this project is really a chance to bring that out in the open, and bring that from a very academic sense, and towards using those academic tools to be able to tell and paint a story from the personal to the systems, and really find solutions that work along that entire line. Oops.
Camille, you're muted.
Thank you. That mute button is very important. I'm going to turn it over to Bill Kennedy, and he will say a bit about his background, as well as to give a specific example of some of the ways he uses, he applies racial equity principles.
Thank you, Camille. And thank you as well for your discussion of the dissonance that we sometimes feel between attorneys and community groups, and particularly legal services attorneys and those groups. I spent 41 years in legal services, and I'm also, I understand, the only white male on the panel here, and I certainly am very much aware of that. But I do want to suggest this. We wanted to talk about the methods of engagement. One is, all attorneys don't work in a clinical setting. And I think when I started in the 70s at California Rural Legal Assistance, and again at Legal Services in Northern California, our primary method of engagement has been variously called community lawyering, rebellious lawyering, or social justice lawyering, in which we tried to build institutions of power that the clients determined. And so over the past 14 years, we've been working on, with the Race Equity Project, working with community groups to once again address issues of racial inequity using tools that have been developed. Those tools briefly are identifying racialized structures, using racial impact statements to do so, and I'm going to talk about that more. Implicit bias, racial anxiety, and stereotype threat, and how to de-bias systems, addressing those, using mapping, framing, and mindfulness as methods of incorporating power building strategies. So, to the example, I was working with legal aid of Iowa Legal Aid and the National Consumer Law Center to create a tool that we are calling a racial impact statement. In that case, it starts with a knowledge of data, disparate outcomes, as Purvi pointed out. That's where it begins. And then applying a complex systems analysis to figure out where, in fact, what institutions are bearing upon that. The issue here in Iowa that National Consumer Law Center was raising was the crushing debt from student loans. And the data suggested that that debt was, in fact, a larger burden for people of color than it was for white people. So the question was, looking at the complex systems, what is going on? Can we just say that the collection agents are racist and leave it at that? But through the systems analysis, we discovered no, there were in fact different methods and different scripts, different processes for collection based upon the race of the debtor. So having gone beyond the initial outcomes and finding in fact there was a structure, and in fact there were written written instructions on dealing with people differently based upon racial, ethnic lines, based upon gender lines as well. We were able to expose that structure, but the question then became, so where's the power? How can we make the decision makers vulnerable? And that's where the last point comes in, is you take data and structure and you tie it together with a community narrative. And you expose, in fact, you link the operations of that collection system to decision makers, and there comes the vulnerability. So an example of working with clients to use one of the tools of racial justice advocacy. So do you want me to go on? Okay, I think because of time, I'll just give that one example.
And Camille, mute.
I'm just going to keep it unmuted. Thank you, Bill. And I know there was a little feedback on the line, so thank you for just pushing through that. I know it can be really distracting. Oh, and now you're muted, but the example, I think, I just saw a question about the example. So what I heard Bill say was that he was working with an organization and used something called a racial impact statement, which incorporates many of and actually is something that comes from outside the legal aid community and outside many legal organizations that we're bringing in, which says, okay, this is the policy. Let's actually look at what the impact is on Black people, on African immigrants, on Hmong, on Chinese second generation, on LGBTQ, and I'm mixing all of these in because we're still evolving on language. This is more than racial equity. It is equity, but race is at the center of it because for some reason we just can't seem to look directly at it for too long unless we have a reminder. There's a resistance to asking those questions. I'll share another brief piece and then turn it back to questions. An example from Bill's program, where literally just asking his advocates when he was at another legal services organizations to ask the question, is race a factor? Just look at it. they discovered that Medicaid was paying out, and correct me if I'm wrong, paying different amounts to white recipients than Black recipients. And so
$4,400 a year was paid on behalf of white recipients, $2,200 for African American, $1,800 for Latino, and if you disaggregate the Asian population, even less for newcomers. It was outrageous. It had been that way for a decade. No one ever asked the question.
Right, and thank you. And so, from a legal services or legal provider advocate perspective, the message is ask the question. And for if I'm speaking to another audience, whether you're in a community group, you are a survivor advocate, ask them to ask the question, and and know that they have access to levers of power just as you do, but utilize them to take advantage of those access of power. Kip, I want to come back to you for just a moment, and then I'll turn it back to Lisa Lynn. And just I was asked to give some examples. How is this relevant in the DV context? You've heard, I mean, the work that all of the folks at the table are doing is amazing. One of the tools that we've talked about in the past is mapping. And so I know we've talked a little bit about mapping resources. Can you talk about that process just a little bit for folks?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about our opportunity mapping program, which basically sort of maps where certain systems, certain resources are within a community. This is a program we've been using really since our inception about 13 years ago. We started looking at it in terms of housing and where housing was situated, how much the housing was, and who was living in those areas. And so it gave a really good, clear picture in any type of jurisdiction, whether it be a city or a county or a region, about who had access to not only housing. We started to expand it into schools, hospitals, education opportunities, transportation opportunities, to really give this full picture, not only of who had access to opportunity based off of where people were living, where people were working, where people were playing, but also how these opportunities work together, right? How housing is really sort of the root of, at the root of opportunities that people have close to them. So this really sort of illustrated on a map and illustrated by census sort of how people who were whiter and wealthier tended to have not only maybe better housing, but in this case, better health services, more expanded health services, more expanded social services related to domestic violence or intimate partner violence than people who were maybe living in poor areas, particularly people living in rural areas, inner city areas, and people who were browner and poor. So that's really kind of the basis of that work. And that work, we work usually with either census tracts, maybe sometimes zip codes. We work with communities large and small, so we work at different geographic locations, and really just sort of map where statistics say more opportunity is now and is likely to be in the future. One of the success stories that I like to talk about in that is our work on the south side here of Columbus, which is a neighborhood that is in transition after years of sort of poverty and blight. And it's sort of revitalizing in a way, but people there are afraid of gentrification. And so we were sort of brought in to kind of tell the tale of who's living where and who has access to opportunity, even within this neighborhood, which is actually huge. And so in looking at that, we could see that literally along the main thoroughfare of the community, opportunity and wealth were split. On one side, where most of the white people lived, the housing was better, the schools were better, services were better, and literally on the other side, less than a fourth of a mile away, it was like living in a whole different world, and where people didn't have access to services, schools were worse, children were worse off, violence was a bigger problem, and services did not carry over. And this is in a small, relatively small area. So even when you're in a small area, the opportunity mapping can show how opportunity doesn't necessarily follow a place as much as it follows people. And so we were able to sort of build a lot of things on that. So why is that happening? And that's where our work in implicit bias, race, and cognition came in. Sort of where were people being sort of steered in terms of housing? How were African American children of color being treated in schools that were mixed in the neighborhood? How are they being treated by police in the street versus people who were treated differently? What did that have to say about sort of what was going on in the minds of service providers and community liaisons and police officers? And then that kind of spread out into who has a say in how the community is being built anyway, and how is that built off of those assumptions that are already there in the community. So we looked at how meetings were structured, who was on local boards, who had access to power, who didn't, what were the social connections like. And we were able to see that even in this relatively small area where people were living close, some of them for years, some people historically were left out of conversations, most likely people of color, and some people had more access, and those people were usually new coming in. And that had nothing to do with sort of what they were bringing to the table in terms of expertise. It did have a lot to do with sort of assumptions about what they would be able to bring to the table. So even within that mapping project, from sort of mapping where opportunity was and wasn't, and who had access to it, we were able to tell a story about how the neighborhood functioned, from the brain, from the mind, and from the individual, to community relationships, and finally to how things were structured in order to make changes to how the community would revitalize in the future. So because of that, we were able to come together to bring a new leadership academy into the neighborhood that sort of led from the middle and led from culturally safe spaces, a new affordable housing structure that really worked for the community members that were worse off, and with working with community partners to, what was the third one? What was the third one? I always forget it. Restructure job opportunities in the neighborhood to make use of existing third places, existing community places where people tended to gather, particularly people who couldn't gather in more sort of formal spaces. So it's kind of, that opportunity mapping at the root of what we do in that sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I want to say, again, this conversation, it's so exciting, and the work is an evolution that's happened over, decades, hundreds of years. Communities of color have always been doing this work, and people who are lawyers, there's a subset that's always been doing this work. There are folks who are advocates who have always been doing this work. And the exciting part of this is that we can bridge the gaps that are that we need to bridge to get out of each other's way, to stop interrupting the movement when we don't realize that it's happening, but also to use more of the tools that folks aren't even aware of in the legal toolbox to expand their power and expand the power available to their communities. I'll stop there and turn it back to, is it Lisa Lynn or Sarah?
Erica, actually.
Erica, great. My delayed. Great, thank you.
You're muted, Erica.
Mm-hmm.
You are
1 minute.
You've got it.
I know.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say what an honor it really is to be part of this project that works with all of these really incredible partners that bring such rich expertise and deep experience and critical frameworks. It's challenging work, and I'm just so appreciative of everybody on this call today. Over the course of the past many months, we have all just the willingness of folks to roll up our sleeves, and the willingness of folks to make mistakes, and also have wide open ears for learning. It really has been a process thus far in terms of engaging one another, and I'm thrilled as we share our thoughts today to think forward to the opportunities as we see all the participants sharing their perspectives as well. So just deep appreciation and acknowledgement that this work and this the type of challenges that we're talking about today and the opportunities that we're talking about are just so deeply needed at this moment in time. So thank you all.
Yeah, this is
Lisa.
I just want to.
Sarah?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo Erica's deep thanks, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. As of a couple of minutes ago, there were still 50 of you and more hanging in there with us. But just to echo Erica's thanks, and particularly thanks for all the work that you do in communities and on behalf of folks who need that help every day. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for some final wrap up.
And I'm going to echo. First, I'm going to mute everybody. Sorry. I have the pleasure of hopefully extending your excitement. I don't know about you, but I want to know more. And so all I have to say is we also want to know more from you all listening, whether you have had to leave us or you're still here and present. Once you leave, you will be directed towards an evaluation page. Please not only let us know what you thought of the webinar, but share what it is that you're doing so that we can inform the later webinars and continue to inform our work. And then so we can get to so we can dive in together. Just a few resources and announcements as we leave. One, go to CSAJ's page. It's chock full of stuff, and it will be full of even more things that were mentioned on the call. We're building a resource library with our partners right now, and that will be expanded. The PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar today will also be there. And perhaps more importantly, I want to point you to how we're going to dive in deeper. Camille, Kit from Kirwan, and Bill on March 23rd are going to dive deeper into the race equity work from their contexts and communities that they work with. And then in May and June, as Lisa mentioned at the beginning, our advocacy partners are going to similarly dive in and provide us even more. So I hope that you put us on your dance card and you join us this spring and summer as we dive deeper and learn from and with each other. And that is really all I have to say. So again, thank you. Thanks to our partners. Here, I'm going to unmute you all for a final farewell.
Farewell.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Looking forward to continuing to learn and grow with everyone.
Thanks, everybody. It's been really wonderful. I appreciate hearing everything that everybody had to say, both on video as well as on chat. And great.
Absolutely.